All right, Chaver on Zoom, we're still good? Excellent. All right, Shabbos say good morning, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. Thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tammuz. Rabbi Naftali Tilson of Talmud Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all the Shimon Shoshos this month in commemoration of the yard site of his dear parents, Rabbi Yonah ben Avram Leib and Rivka Bas Yaakov. We hope that in the merit, and of course in the merit of all of us continuing to learn the Daf and Meretz Hashem, till we finish the cycle Bekarav. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, and the family Eina Chama. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Binyamin Fleischman, in memory of his father, Rabbi Shmuel Yudel ben Avram Yaakov, Yehuda and Jenny Goodhart, Le'ili Nishmas Yeshaya Zalman ben Laser, and Leah Sol, in honor of the upcoming marriage of Avram Silber and Zizi Frankel, and Binyamin and Alana Levin, in honor of the birth of a granddaughter, Leora Sarah Levin. We thank all of our sponsors for their incredible generosity. Beautiful, beautiful combination of milestones of the past, milestones of the future. And with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Lamed Ches 38. And we are picking up in Meretz Hashem. We have a lot to do today at the Mishnah on Lamed Zayin Amud Beis. The Mishnah is 37b. We'll say a new topic. Eved Shenishba Upadua. We'll say if you have an Eved Kinani. So remember again, Eved Kinani is a non-Jewish servant who, upon being taken as a servant to a Jew, always, it's interesting because Eved, of course, really translates as slave. We're often reticent to use the word slave because generally slavery has such a negative connotation. But the truth is we've seen so much throughout Shas to recognize that halacha protects the interests of the Eved Kinani, the non-Jewish slave, in such dramatic ways. So again, sometimes it just feels a little bit more comfortable to use the word servant. But this is a non-Jewish servant. So now what happens? The non-Jewish servant, the Eved Kinani, runs away. He runs away. And what happens? Upadua. And then he is redeemed. Now I both say the case over here is he is redeemed by another Jew. So let's say, for example, Eved Kinani is owned by Ruvain. Eved Kinani runs away, and Shimon redeems him. So in other words, he runs away, he's taken captive by someone else, and ultimately, again, Shimon, now a second Jew, redeems him. So what's the halacha? Imlushum ben Chorin, I skipped. Upadua. Imlushum Eved Yishtabed. If he's redeemed by Shimon, Jew number 2, for the sake of servitude, then ultimately, again, he comes back to servitude. Imlushum ben Chorin, if he's redeemed ultimately in order to be a free person, then ultimately, again, lo yishtabed. Then he cannot be re-enslaved. Rabbi Shmuel says, ben kach yishtabed. Shmuel says, no, regardless. Once he is redeemed, by definition, he returns back to servitude. So we'll say, very interesting machlokes. Tanakama, essentially saying that the status of the servant is dependent on what the intent was when he was redeemed. Shmuel is saying, no. So intention is irrelevant. At the end of the day, when he is redeemed, he automatically goes back to servitude. Good. Let's analyze. Maya Skinon. What's the case, says the Gemara? Ilema lifnei yeyosh. So I'll say, if we're talking on, I'll say, remember, so Ruvain owns this Eved Kinani. Eved Kinani runs away. Shimon is one who's redeeming him. Shabbos, the Gemara says, what's the case? And really what the case is very much dependent on the mindset of a Ruvain, the original master. If it's lifnei yeyosh, Shabbos, remember again, so what's yeyosh? Yeyosh means essentially you give up hope, right? Despair. Now, we're not talking about a state, an emotional state, right? But rather, again, a halachic state. When the Eved runs away, does Ruvain have intention of getting him back or not? So if Ruvain has intention, that's called lifnei yeyosh, prior to despair. If Ruvain does not have intention, that's achar yeyosh. So if we're talking about that Ruvain has not yet given hope of reclaiming his servant, then l'shum ben chorin amai lo yishtabed. I don't understand. So if that's supposed that if it's lifnei yeyosh, see, even if Shimon, second Jew, redeems the Eved Kinani for the sake of emancipation, why wouldn't he still be a slave? The first owner has not yet had yeyosh. He hasn't given up hope of retrieving him. El achar Yehush. Rather, it must be talking about a case where Reuven has already experienced Yehush. If that's the case, L'shum eved amay yishtabed. If that's the case, then ultimately, even if Shimon redeems the servant for the sake of servitude, if it's after Yehush, servant should go free. Amar Abaye says, no. The olim lifnei Yehush, we're talking about a case of lifnei Yehush. Therefore, again, L'shum eved yishtabed l'rabo rishon. So therefore, again, I will say, if he's redeemed, ultimately again for servitude, therefore halacha l'maisi goes back to his first master. L'shum ben chorin lo yishtabed lo l'rabo rishon v'lo l'rabo sheni. But if Shimon redeems the eved for the sake of emancipation, he does not return to servitude to master one or to master two. Why not? L'rabo sheni lo dehalushem ben chorin parke. He doesn't go. Bro, say first wide line on the bottom of lam and zayin number base. He doesn't go to the second master because the second master, right, Shimon, redeemed him ultimately again for emancipatory purposes. L'rabo rishon ami lo dilma memani v'lo parki. But he doesn't go back to Rabbi Rishon either. Why not? Because Rabbi says since it's li'achar Yehush, ultimately again. Lifnei Yehush, ultimately, again, the first master may not actually want to redeem him. Okay, so we'll say that's the first approach of Abaye. Reb Shimon Gamliel says, Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer, ben kach u ben kach yishtabed. Whatever, or as we'll say, the intent of Shimon when he redeems the Eved Kanani is absolutely irrelevant. Either way, this Eved is going back to servitude. Why? Kasaver kishem shemitzvah liftos es b'nei chorin, kach mitzvah liftos es ha'avadim. So I will say this is very interesting. To get into the psychology here a little bit, why would the intention of Shimon play a role in this at all? So I will say what's driving all of this is as follows. Do people feel a mandate to redeem an Eved Kanani who has been taken into captivity? Right? After all, again, I will say, on one hand, he's quasi-Jewish, right? He's like a little bit of Jewish. He's an Eved. He's an Eved to a Jew, which endows him with some Judaic identity, and certainly upon emancipation, he becomes a full-fledged Jew. On the other hand, he's not a Ben Chorin. So Rabbi Shimon Gamliel holds that halacha l'maaseh people feel a moral mandate to go ahead and redeem even an Eved Kanani. And therefore, halacha l'maaseh will say, that's why Rabbi Shimon Gamliel in the Mishnah says, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel in the Mishnah says, that no matter what, when you redeem this Eved Kanani, he's going back to servitude. And don't worry about it. People will still redeem him. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon Gamliel holds the same way that there is a mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim, to redeem captives by free people. Then ultimately, again, there is a mitzvah to redeem avodim kinanim, who are the property, the servants of Jews as well. Incredible. Rava Amarava says, no. Leolam achar Yehush. Rava chooses to set up the case of says after Yehush. So Reuven, the original owner, has despaired of retrieving his Eved Kanani, Ulushum Eved Yishtabed Rabo Sheni, and therefore again, if the Eved is redeemed, ultimately again for servitude purposes, he becomes the servant of Shimon, the guy who redeems him. We call him, we'll say, by the way, in this case, we're calling the second master, right? The first master is Reuven. Who's the second master? In this case, the second master is Shimon, the guy who's redeeming the Eved Kanani. So therefore, again, it's after Yehush, and therefore, again, if he's redeemed for captivity purposes, for servitude purposes, he'll go to Shimon, L'shum ben Chorim, but if he's redeemed to be a free man, Lo yishtabed lo l'rabo rishon lo l'rabo sheni. Then ultimately, again, he's emancipated. He's fully emancipated. L'rabo sheni lo, he doesn't go to the second master. Why? L'shum ben Chorim parke, because Shimon redeemed him to be a free man. L'rabo rishon nami lo, he won't go to the first master either. Why? Because ultimately, again, it's after Yehush. Shabbos like this is actually a very cohesive approach. So again, Rav is saying the case. Here's let's just frame it. Reuven owns an Eved Kanani. Eved Kanani runs away. Reuven has Yehush. Right? He does not have any hope of reclaiming his Eved Kanani. Shimon comes along and redeems the Eved Kanani for what purpose? L'shum ben Chorin, for the sake of emancipation. So now when Shimon redeems him, the Eved is not going to be a servant to Shimon. Why? Because Shimon redeemed him for emancipatory purposes. He's also not going to go back to Reuven. Why? Because it's achar Yehush. That's the interpretation of Rav in the Mishnah. What about Rabbi Shmuel? Remember, Rabbi Shmuel in the Mishnah says, no matter for what your intention is when you redeem me, he always goes back to servitude. Rabbi Shmuel Omer ben kach u ben kach yishtabed k'dechizkiah. What is Chizkiah? Mipnei ma amru ben kach u ben kach yishtabed. Why is it that, according to Rabbi Shmuel, based on according to Chizkiah, no matter what the intent is of Shimon when he redeems the Eved Kanani, the Eved is always going back to servitude. Why does he say that? It is incredible. Shelo yehei kol echad ve'echad holech umapil atzmo legayasos umafkio atzmo miyad rabo. I will say, Rabbi Shmuel says this this is a little bit of the time. It's like a tikkun olam piece over here. So I will say, if an Eved knows that he can run away, be redeemed, and be redeemed for emancipation, then what have you just done? You've incentivized Avadim Kinanim to run away. Because then what's going to happen? Run away, right? Stay out of sight for a while. Let your first master have Yeosh. Second master will redeem you, hopefully more for emancipatory purposes, and you're free. You've created an incentive for Avadim to run away. Therefore, again, Rav Shmuel disincentivizes, Avadim running away by essentially saying no matter how you are redeemed, halacha l'maaseh going back to servitude. Incredible. So I'll say, so just this position of Rav is kind of going to be our guiding light over here for the next little bit. I was going to question it, but just to, so you know how we're setting up the case. Ruvain owns an Eved Kanani. Eved Kanani runs away. Ruvain has Yeosh. He gives up hope of retrieving the Eved. Shimon redeems the Eved. Ultimately, again, Shimon redeems the Eved for emancipatory purposes. In that case, Eved goes free. Why? Because again, it was Shimon's intent to set him free, and Reuven already had Yeosh, so there's no master to go back to. That's the position of Tanna Kama. Rabbi Shmuel says, no. When you redeem that Eved, he always goes back to servitude. Servitude of who? Servitude of first master, because if it's not that way, then you're incentivizing Avadim to run away, because running away will be a mechanism for them to find freedom, to find emancipation. Good. So Meisvei, Gemara is the Kasha. Amar Lahan, Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says, Kashim Shemitzah Liftos as Penei Chorin Kach Mitzvah Liftos as Avadim. Rabbi Shmuel said the same way that there is a mitzvah to redeem free people, there is a mitzvah to redeem Avadim. So Bishlam Allah Abaye. So according to Abaye, this makes sense. The Amar Lifnei Yeosh, who says that all of this is happening before Yeosh, right? The Eved is being redeemed before Reuven had Yeosh. Hainu de Amar Kishem. That's why the Lashon is Kishem. El Rava de Amar La'achar Yeosh. But according to Rava, who says it's happening after Yeosh, Hai Kishem. What do you mean Kishem? Mishum de Chizkiyahu. As you just said before, his whole position is based on Chizkiyah. Amar L'Charava, Rab Shimon Liel Lo Havi Yadi Mai Kami Rabbana. The reality is Rab Shimon Liel did not know the core position of the Rabbana, of the Tanna Kama. And therefore, this is what he was saying. Vachi Kamarlu. Ilifnei Yeosh Kamrisu, Hainu Kishem. See, if you're setting up the case, ultimately again, Lifnei Yeosh, then it'll be like this. Ila Achar Yeosh, if it's after Yeosh, ultimately again like Chizkiah. Good. Or the Rava, Damar La'achar Yeosh. So what's according to Rava, who sets up the case, which was the last position we saw, that it's after Yeosh. Ul Rabo Sheni, right? We'll say, so if it's according to Rava, and it's after Yeosh, so we'll say, so ultimately again, and therefore halacha l'maisa. Remember, according to Rava, if the second master, if Shimon does redeem the Eved for servitude purposes, then ultimately again, the second master, Shimon, gets to keep the Eved, right? Because first master, Reuven, already had Yeosh. Here's the Shaila, Rabbi say, Rabbi Shini Miman Kanile. We'll say, who is Shimon acquiring the Eved from? To which the Gemara says, Shabai. So ultimately, from the captors, Shabai Gufei Mi Kanile. But do the captors themselves actually acquire the Eved? In Kanile Maisi Yadav. Yes, they acquire the Eved, I will say, not as much that the captors acquire the guf of the Eved, but rather the captors acquire ultimately, again, the earning powers, right? The Maisi Adayim, the earnings, the production, what the Eved produces. So here's what's interesting. One Gentile cannot own the body of another Gentile. But what can happen over here is one Gentile could own the earning capacity, the Maisei Adayim, the earnings, the product that he produces. How do we know that? Shneimar, V'gam b'bnei toshavim hagarim imachem, mehem tiknu. Pasuk says, we'll say, speaking about the idea, we'll say, we're going to see the idea that from the Torah perspective, the Torah would rather that a Jew possesses an Eved Kanani than an Eved Ivri. That's what we would prefer. That's what we would prefer. So the pasuk says, therefore, from amongst the Gentiles that you live, from amongst the Gentiles you live among. So mehem tiknu, acquire from them. Atem kone mehem. So we'll say you could acquire them. Top of Lamed Ches. Velohem konim mikem. But I will say, ultimately, again, a Gentile cannot own a Jew. A Gentile cannot own a Jew, right? So a Jew could own an Evet Kenani, but ultimately, again, a Gentile cannot own a Jew. And obviously, where do these halachas take effect? Right? These halachas take effect in a Jewish-governed society. In a Jewish-governed society. So therefore, again, in a Jewish-governed society, so a Jew could own an Evet Kenani. But let's say a Kenani, a Gentile cannot own a Jew. Let's say I'll just point out something incredible. Do you want to know the secret to the nitzchias of Klal Yisrael? Why is it that we're here? Why is it that we're here today? After thousands of years of persecution. Right? I will say, even have to go back to thousands of years of persecution. They're just the tragic events that unfolded in Eretz Yisrael, right outside of Eli. Right? How is it that Klal Yisrael is not broken from all of these events throughout thousands of years of persecution? And I will say the answer is because no one could ever own the Jew. That's really what it comes down to. People could persecute us, people could kill us, people could hurt us, people could maim us. You can't own us. The only entity in the world which could ever own a Jew, which could ever own a Yid, is the Ribono Shel Olam. Everyone else could exert control. Everyone else could go in and exert some level of control over me. Control can happen, but not ownership. So because of that personalistic autonomy, because at the end of the day, and I belong to me and I belong to my God. Those are the only two entities who have any level of ownership over me. There's an inner freedom, and that inner freedom manifests itself in the constant and consistent survival of Klal Yisrael. He'll say, remember again, you look what's happening in Eretz Yisrael right now. He'll say, you know, all right, they call it the settlement movement, but you know, we'll say there's like a phrase that is so profound that every single time, as you see this, what happens every single time someone is killed, so what's the response? Building. There's a phrase, Bevinyana tenachamena. We will be consoled through building. We'll be consoled, in other words, you take something from us, we'll just create more. Bevinyana tenachamena. Take something from us, we'll build more. We'll say, where does that freedom of spirit come from? Right? I was going to say, by the rest of the world, often, you kill us, we'll kill you back. Unfortunately, we begin to see the rise of that in some extremist behavior in Eretz Yisrael as well, which has to be condemned on every single level. That's not what we do. That's not how we behave. But I was about the ability to answer loss and death and violence with building and thriving and expansion. That comes from a spirit that cannot be conquered, from a spirit that cannot be owned. I always say, so where does it come from? The source for that is Gittin Lamed Ches Lamed Aleph. The first two words on the line. V'lo heim konim mikem. No one could own us. No one could own us. Incredible. V'lo heim konim zeh mizeh. We'll say, and again, in non-Jews, right, they also can't go ahead and own each other. Yachol lo yiknu zeh et zeh. So we'll say ultimately again, so I'm sorry, v'lo heim konim zeh mizeh. Yachol lo yiknu zeh et zeh. So yachol lo yiknu zeh et zeh. Ha'amrit lo heim konim zeh mizeh. We just said before, what do you mean? They can't acquire each other. Hachi kamar. V'lo heim konim zeh mizeh legufo. Or as well say, one akum cannot own the body of another akum, a guf. So the Gemara says, Yachal lo yiknu zeh zeh l'maaseh yadav. You might have thought that maybe they can't own the earnings of one another as well. Amrit kadachomer. Well, so that's kadachomer. Ovid kochavim Yisrael kona. Right. So ultimately, again, so I'll say, Yisrael could acquire an ovid kochavim. Now we'll say that's a kinyan haguf. Right. Kinyan haguf means literally physical autonomy. Ovid kochavim lokoshkin. So we'll say ultimately again, if a Jew could own an ovid kochavim, so bepashtos an ovid kochavim could own another ovid kochavim. Ben hanim mili bekaspa. That's only true by kasef. Aval bechazaka lo, but not by chazak, but not with chazaka, proprietary act. Amra Papa, 1 second. Ammon uMoav tiaru b'sichon. So we'll say here's what's interesting. Look at the nations of Ammon and Moab, which were overrun by Sichon. Right? I will say Sichon conquered Ammon and Moab. So you see the ability for one akum to overcome another akum. I will say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Ammon and Moab tiharu b'sichon. Amma oved kochavim konem mechaveru karka bechazaka. So I will say, so again, you see from here that one akum can conquer another akum bechazaka. Ashkechan oved kochavim. So the Ashkechan oved kochavim Yisrael min Nalan. Dichsiv vayish mimenu shevi. So Rabbi say there is the ability ultimately, as the Gemara quotes the pasuk vayish mimenu shevi, talked about one of the wars that Klal Yisrael waged in the Midbar, where a Jew was taken captive. So the fact that a Jew ultimately, again, was taken captive, ultimately indicates to us that there could be some level of ownership of, or some level of autonomy of a non-Jew over a Jew. But Rabbi said, but it's not a kinyan aguf. It's not a kinyan aguf. Ultimately, again, it's a kinyan kesef, what we'll call it's a power over earnings. So I will say, so the idea over here, the Gemara is pointing out, just to fit this back in, the Gemara is trying to figure out. So we have this construct, for example, we have this construct where Ruvain, the original owner of the Eved Kanani, went ahead and had Yesh, right? The Eved Kanani runs away. Ruvain has Yesh. Shimon redeems him for servitude purposes. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Shimon acquires him. So the Gemara just says, who is Shimon acquiring him from? To which the answer is, who's he acquiring him from? The captors. But could one Gentile acquire another Gentile? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. Perhaps not in a kinyan haguf capacity, but certainly in an earnings capacity. Although the Gemara does give other examples, let's say by sichon, where there could even be an acquisition by chazaka. Okay, fine. Supposed to listen to this. If an Eved runs away from jail, so we'll say in this case over here, you have an Eved Kanani who was emancipated. Who was incarcerated. He runs away from jail. So we'll say, what's the halacha? So ultimately, again, he goes free. He's emancipated. Rabbi will say, not only that, we force the master to go ahead and write a get shikra, right? Write a document of emancipation. So we'll say, now, what's the point? That Rashi says over here, in order to allow him to get married, right? So an Eved runs away, right? So we'll say, so it's three steps. Ruvain owns an Eved Kanani. Eved Kanani is incarcerated. Eved Kanani runs away from incarceration. So what's the halacha? Upon running away from incarceration, he is free, and we force the master to give him a get shikra. Incredible. So it's not Rabbi Shmuel says, no, benkach u benkach ishtabed. So Rabbi say, this is the same Rabbi Shimon Gamliel over and over and over. And you see what Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is concerned about is creating a system where avadim just keep running away with the hope to gain their emancipation. So I will say, so the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, therefore, no, even if he runs away from jail, ultimately, again, he's still an Eved. Any time that in general Rabbi Shmuel Silber is on record in a Mishnah, the halacha usually follows him chutz me'arev b'tzidon v'raya achrona or re'iyah achrona. So we'll say, so ultimately with the exception of three cases, which we're not going to get into right now, but a specific case of a guarantor, a specific case of that occurred in Sidon, and re'iyah achrona. So b'shlam alabai. So therefore, I will say, Bipashtos, that would mean that the halacha follows Rabbi Shmuel over here as well. So b'shlam alabai. So according to Abaye, we'll say now again, we're trying to fit this in to Abaye and Rava's interpretations of the Mishnah that we had on Zayin Amud Beis. So watch this. Bishlam ala Abaye. Bishlam ala Abaye mukila lahai lifnei Yehush. He'll set up this price as talking about before Yehush. I should say our Mishnah as lifnei Yehush, and ultimately again v'hai the brisa la'achar Yehush. El Rava da Amar the achar Yehush kasha Rabbi Yochanan. I would say according to Rava, who holds that both cases are talking about after Yehush, so he has a contradiction of Rabbi Yochanan. Rava taima mai mishum dechizkiya. So we'll say Rava's whole logic, I will say, is really based on the position ultimately again of Chizkiya. So we'll say, so remember again, what's Chizkiya's logic? Chizkiya says, let me say differently. According to Rava, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's position, right? Rabbi Shimon Gamliel holds that no matter what you redeem the Eved for, he's always going back to servitude. Based on Chizkiya. What was Chizkiya's logic? Chizkiya said that we don't want avadim purposely running away or doing things out of some perceived thought that they're going to be emancipated. We incentivize avadim running away, which is not good. To which the Gemara says, listen to this. So Amar Rava, time mai mishum de Chizkiya. So we'll say boreach shiny. But when a guy runs away from jail, and every guy runs away from jail, it's different. Why? Hashta liktala masra nafshe apule apil nafshi the gayasos. Shabbos say at the end of the day, running away from jail ultimately, again, puts a person in mortal danger. Right? Because if you take a look at Rashi says, "L'ktala masr nafshe kadei lotzeis midei gayasos shar borech min ha'asur v'odeh shim yasigu yiharei." See, I will say in apparently at times of the Gemara, if you're running away from jail and they caught you, they're not putting you back in jail. You know what they're doing? They're killing you. They're killing you. So if this guy is putting himself in mortal danger, ultimately, again, do you think that afterwards he's going to put himself in mortal danger again and put himself back into, and allow himself to fall into the hands of other captors? Fine. So I'm saying to Mashmuel, so we'll say a story that illustrates some of this. Very interesting. I'm saying to Shmuel ishtaboy. So we'll say Shmuel had a maidservant. She was taken captive. Parkua l'shem amsa. So ultimately, she was redeemed for the sake of servitude. Vishadrua lei. Right, and ultimately, again, they sent her back to him. So apparently, someone else redeemed the maidservant, and ultimately went ahead and sent the maidservant back to Shmuel. Shalchulei, they sent to him. Anan Svirlik Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel. We hold like Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel. Therefore, I'll say what they were saying was this maidservant should go back to servitude, because as Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel says, no matter what the intention of emancipation was, Eved always goes back to servitude. So the Gemara says, Shachol Anan Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel Svirlan At Inami Kirabanan Svirlacha Anan L'Shum Amsa Parkinan Nehela. So they said to Mar Shmuel, listen, no matter who you hold like, we just want you to know, we redeemed her for the sake of servitude. So because we redeemed her for the sake of servitude, she should be put back to work. Okay, so the Gemara says, so Anan L'Shum Amsa Parkinan Allah Nehila V'inhu Savar Lifnei Yeyoshawa. Now both say, listen to this. So both say, so just to frame the case, Shmuel has a maidservant. She runs away, or she's taken. What's Lashon? She's taken captive. She's taken captive. She is redeemed by a group of other people. They sent her back to Mar Shmuel to once again be in servitude, and they send Mar Shmuel the following message. They say to him, listen, we hold like Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel, which Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel say in the Mishnah, no matter what your intention is when you redeem the Eved, Eved's always going back to servitude, right? And they said to Mar Shmuel, but even you, we don't know who you hold like, but even if you hold like the Rabbanan, just know, we redeemed her for the sake of servitude. So put her back to work. Meanwhile, what happened? They thought, Rabbi say, that for Shmuel, this was before Yeosh. Velohi la'achar le'yeshava. Rabbi say, and in fact, what they didn't know was Shmuel already had Yeosh of reclaiming her. So because he already had Yeosh of reclaiming her, therefore what? Ushmuel lo mibai di ishtabude lo mishtabid ba elagita di cherusa namelo etzrecha. So we'll say, so therefore again, because from Shmuel it was after Yeosh, therefore I will say when she came back, what did he do? He emancipated her. I will say not only did he emancipate her, but he actually held that she didn't even need to get shikra, a document of emancipation. Why not? Listen to this, I will say. Shmuel Tamei Damar Shmuel Hamafkir Avdo Yatza Lecherus Ve'eno Tzarech get shikra. Because Shmuel is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, when one is mafkir, one is hefker, right? One makes their evet hefker, the evet ownerless, the evet goes free and doesn't require a get shikra. Now, both sides, remember again, Yeosh is effectively making an item hefker, right? When you despair of ever reclaiming something, essentially what you do is you make it ownerless. Shene'emar v'chol eved ish miknas kasev. So both sides, Pasuk says, any eved ish v'lo eved isha, ela eved sheyesh lo rishus rabo alav karoi eved. Eved she'ein lo rishus rabo alav in karoi eved. It is only a servant, Rabbosai, whose master has control over him, that's called an eved. But once someone doesn't have control over you, you are no longer an eved. No longer an eved. So Rabbosai, so this is really, if you think about it, this is a great case which helps to illustrate the nature of this machlokas. So just one more time, let's just look at this once more, because this makes the Mishnah come alive. So understand what's happened over here. So Shmuel has a maidservant taken captive. Another party, was a group over here, redeemed the maidservant, sent her back to Shmuel. And they sent her back to Shmuel with the following message. We, the group number 2, we hold like Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel. What does Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel say? Anytime you redeem an Eved, what happens? Go back to servitude. Why is that? Let's go with the idea of Chizkiah, because Hashem says we want to disincentivize, so Avadim running away, thinking that they're going to find some form of emancipation. But they said to Shmuel, we don't know what you hold. We don't know what you hold. But even if you hold like the Rabbanan of the Mishnah, so what did the Rabbanan of the Mishnah say? The Rabbanan of the Mishnah made it sound like it depends why the second party is redeeming the Eved. Redeeming for servitude, redeeming for emancipation. We redeemed her for the sake of servitude. Therefore, she should be back in your service. Maidservant gets back to Shmuel. What does Shmuel say to the maidservant? What does he say to her? You're free to go. Why? Because for Shmuel, he had already had Yeyosh. He had already given up hope of reclaiming her. And I will say not only that, so therefore again, he holds like the Rabbanon, it's Achar Yeyosh, therefore she goes free. Not only that, she doesn't need to get shikhr, she doesn't need a document of emancipation. Why? Because Yeyosh effectively makes an Eved Hefker, and Shmuel holds that once an Eved becomes Hefker, no need for get shikhr. So fast, just an excellent illustrative story. Great job, Gemara. Let's go back there. Says the Gemara, Am say Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Abba Bar Zutra. So we'll say another story. So what happens? There was a maidservant. Of Rabbi Abba Bar Zutra. Ishtaboy. So same idea. Maidservant of Rabbi Abba was taken captive. Parka Hahu Tarmudah. So there was a Tarmudoin who went ahead, a Tarmudah who redeemed her. L'shum Isisa. Now watch this. It's an interesting case. He redeemed her for the sake of marrying her. Okay. So Shalchu Lididei. So they sent ultimately a message to Rabbi Abba. Listen, if you're happy with this course of action, do me a favor, send her a get shikhr. Send her a get shikhr. This way she's fully emancipated. She can marry. So the Gemara says, "Hey, Dami, what's the case? Ultimately, again, if ultimately again there's the ability to redeem her, then Allah, why does she need a get shikhr? And again, ultimately, again, if it's not a full redemption for emancipation, then what goes get shikhr? But say here's the difference. The difference was that, because in general you see that there's the ability, if they thought that if they sent a get shikhr, they'd have an easier time redeeming her, right? Why? Because I will say, again, it's easier to do like a charity campaign for a Jew than it is for an Eved Kinani, right? So therefore, again, if she has the get shikhr, then Labai says she's emancipated. If she's emancipated, it's easier to raise money for her. What's the other possibilities? He didn't want to redeem her. So say could very well be that in fact this Talmudai did not want to go ahead and redeem her. Rather, he was happy to marry her as is. Once, however, the get shikhr was sent, the whole thing becomes known that she was a shifcha. I suppose say this is an interesting statement over here. But Mar said that an akum prefers the Jew, the animal of a Jew, to his own wife. And I will say that's speaking to the general immorality of an akum. That's only true in private. But publicly, ultimately, again, it would be embarrassing. So I will say what's interesting is as follows. This Talmudai had an interest in marrying this woman as long as it wasn't known that she was a shifcha. The problem was, once the get shikhr would be sent, what would happen? The entire matter becomes public, and then ultimately it becomes something degrading for him. Fine. But we'll say another story which helps to illustrate some of these concepts. Hahi amse dahav pumpadisa. Davakara the hava kama abdebe in shi usura. So we'll say a very interesting case. There was a maidservant in Pumpadisa who was an immoral woman and was engaging in immoral acts with Jewish men. Okay, so we'll say now watch this. Amar Abaye, Sabai says, Ilav Dam Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Kol Meshachrer Avdo over Baasei Hava Kaifina Leilamara. So it's for Kasav Lagide de Cherusa. So we'll say now, watch what's happening over here. So you have this maidservant, right? She's owned by Ruvain. She's immoral and engaging in immoral acts with Jewish men. So what happens? So we'll say, now here's what's interesting. In this case, Sabai comes along and says, what I would like to be able to do is emancipate her. Why? Because if she become emancipated, then what Rabbi says, she can get married. And if she gets married, she has a husband who's going to take care of her and help her to avoid this type of behavior. In other words, the assumption is the reason why she's engaging in this immorality is because she's not tethered to any type of relationship. So emancipate her, let her get married, and hopefully, again, she'll correct her immoral ways. So the Gemara says, so Abaye says, I would force the master to emancipate her, were it not for the fact that Shmuel said, whoever emancipates his Eved Kanani is in violation of a positive commandment. We'll say, what's the positive commandment? The pasuk says, Li'olam bahem ta'avodu. Ultimately, again, you should keep your Eved Kanani forever. I will say there is a positive commandment to keep your Eved Kanani, not to emancipate him. Not to emancipate him. But I will say the Sefer HaChinuch says, why? Why is there mitzvahs asay to not emancipate your Eved Kanani? And the Sefer HaChinuch says something amazing. He says, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu would rather that the menial labor be performed by an akum and not be performed by Jews. Right, that's it. It's covered Yisrael, right? Honor for the Jewish people. That let there be a menial workforce of non-Jews, ultimately again who do the work instead of Jews. That's the logic. So therefore, Abaye says, I would force the master. Normally, I would force the master to emancipate her, except for the fact that there's an assay that you're not allowed to do this. To which the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, because of like, I'm sorry, I just lost the place. Good. Rava says, no. So we'll say, listen to this. So comes along Rabbi Yehuda, comes along Ravina. Ravina says, no, the truth is, in a case like this, you actually would be allowed to emancipate the Eved. Why? Because Rabbi say there are isurim that are happening over here. So the Gemara says, "Va'abai mishum isura lo, v'am Rabbi Chanina bar Rav Katina am Rabbi Yitzchak, ma'aseh bi'isha achos, shechatzia shivcha v'chatzia baschorin." So we'll say, listen to this. There was a case of a woman who is chatzi shivcha, chatzi baschorin. I will say, how could you ever have a case like that of a woman who is half shivcha, half baschorin? Shutfin, excellent. You have a jointly owned shivcha, Ruven and Shimon, right? Ruven emancipates his chelik, Shimon does not. So she is in this very difficult predicament that she doesn't have complete identity. So we'll say, Amud Beis, the kafu asraba v'asa v'aschorin. So we'll say they forced the master to emancipate her. So we'll say, what do you see from here? That as much as there is a mitzvah's asay to keep your Eved Kanani, when there is a compelling reason for emancipation, we'll force that. So the Gemara says, "V'amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak minag hefker naguba." And Rabbi Nachman said, what was the problem with this woman? The problem with this woman was she was engaged in immoral behavior. So you see from here, Rabbi say that although there is an assay to keep your Eved Kanani, Lamaisa, when there is a compelling mitzvah reason, you're permitted to emancipate. So the Gemara says, Hachi hashta. Hasam lo le'eved chazia v'lo ben chorin chazia. We'll say it's different. In the case of chatzi shefia, chatzi baschorin, we'll say the problem we have is, as they say, she's nishtahin nishtaher, right? She can't marry anyone. She can't go ahead and marry a ben chorin. Why? Because she's a chatzi shefcha, right? She can't marry an eved, ultimately again because she's a chatzi baschorin. She can't marry anyone. We'll say there she's really stuck because she does not go ahead and have a complete identity. However, again, hacha efshar demiyachid la la'avdei uminter la. I will say in the case ultimately that we said before, I will say, right, the case of the shivcha who was engaging in immoral behavior with Jews, I will say there is the ability to kind of enter her into a solid monogamous relationship with who? With another eved. In other words, the Gemara is suggesting over here is there is another remedy over here. Besides emancipation, right? So in other words, when the only remedy ultimately is emancipation, right? So an einachinami for a mitzvah purpose, we'll do that. But when there is another remedy, then we'll take emancipation off the table. Incredible. So Gufa. Rabbi Shmuel, call him a Shachar Avda. I will say, by the way, what's interesting is you see from this Gemara, just al derech hashkaf, what do you see from this Gemara? The worst thing in life is to have identity ambiguity, right? when you don't know who you are, it is almost impossible to navigate yourself forward, right? We'll say the worst state to be in is Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin, right? Who am I, right? Am I an Eved, am I Ben Chorin? And we'll say, what's the problem? When you have identity ambiguity and you don't know who you are, you cannot navigate forward. You're stuck. I'll say, it's so true. As a metaphor in life, let's say, I could be doing things wrong. Most of us are doing things wrong on a daily basis. But if I know who I am, and I know where I need to get to, and I know what I have to accomplish, I know what I have to fix, I'll get there. Masha'in Kain, if I have identity ambiguity, and I don't know who I am, I'm a Chatzi Eved, I'm a Chatzi Ben Chorin, I'm a Chatzi this, I'm a Chatzi that, right? So we'll say then the problem is, I can't really advance my personalistic agenda because since I don't have clarity of identity, I also don't have clarity of vision. Such an incredible yesod. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. If somebody were to ask you, is it better to be a Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin, or to be an Eved? So we'll say, before today's daf, I would have said, of course, Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin, because at least you're quasi Ben Chorin. Not true. Better to be an Eved. Better, why? I was saying, because at least as an Eved, I know who I am, I know where I'm going, and ultimately, even if my goal is to become a Ben Chorin, right? Ultimately, I know what I have to get to. Clarity of identity, clarity of knowing who you are and what you are, gives you clarity of purpose, clarity of vision, clarity of direction. Masha'in Kain, when there's identity ambiguity, I don't know who I am, then ultimately, again, you spend your life spinning your wheels in the mud of life, unable to fully advance your personalistic agenda. Incredible yisod. Let's go back there. So Gufa, Rabbi Shmuel, Kol Meshachar Avdo over Ba'aseh. Paul says, you saw before, anyone who emancipates his Eved, is in violation of a positive commandment. Shneimar, Li'olam Bahem Ta'avodu. The pasuk says, you should go ahead and keep your Eved forever. May say, one second. May say, Rabbi Eliezer Shnichas Beis HaKnesset Lo Matza Asara B'Shichrar Avdo V'Shlimu LaAsara. So I was saying, now listen to this. So I was saying, there was a story of Rabbi Eliezer who walked into shul, and what happened? He walked in with his Eved Kinani, and there were only 9 people. There wasn't a minyan. What did Rabbi Eliezer do? So we'll say Rabbi Eliezer emancipated his Eved, made him the 10th guy, and ultimately they had the minyan. Now, boss, you know what the end of the story is? He left during Kedusha, right? The Eved, right? I'm a regular Jew, so I'm getting out of here early, right? In other words, I'm not staying till the end of this. When he was an Eved Kinani, he was staying the whole time, right? Now that he's a Jew, he's packing up from there as soon as he can, right? So I'll say, Solamaisa, what happens? See, what do you see from here? You see from here a case where Halacha Lamaisa, he emancipated the Eved. So I don't say, there's a mitzvah to say that you can emancipate the Eved, to which the Gemara says, mitzvah shiny. A mitzvah is different. So we'll say, so what you begin to see, by the way, is that halacha l'maisa, there is a mitzvah, I say a positive commandment, to keep your Eved Kanani and to not emancipate him. But what you begin to see is when there are compelling reasons or a need for emancipation, either ultimately, again, for a mitzvah purpose, or I will say, in the case of Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin, we do force the remain, is actually Machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, but we pass like Beis Hillel that we do force the master to emancipate the remaining Eved piece, because he's stuck. So when there is a compelling reason for emancipation, we'll force that as well. Incredible. Let's finish up. Tanra, so Gemara goes weiter. Tanra Banan, Liolam Bahem Tavo, the Rishus. So ultimately, again, Pasuk says, you shall go ahead and enslave them forever. Rishus Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says it's optional. It's not obligatory. Torah is giving you maybe like an Eitz Tova. This is a good idea, but it's not obligatory. Rabbi Kiva says Chova. Rabbi Kiva says no, it's absolutely obligatory. I have a Dilma Rabbi Eliezer Savala Kimandam Rishus. So we'll say, going back to the previous story where Rabbi Eliezer emancipated his Eved in order to go to make the minyan. So maybe he holds like the opinion that says the Olam Bahem Tavod was not an obligation, but rather it's a Rishus. To which the Gemara says, so what Rabbi Eliezer himself is on record as saying Chova, that ultimately, again, there is an obligation to keep your Eved Kinani and not to emancipate him, unless, of course, there's some type of acute need. But it's an incredible Gemara. Amar Rabba, Bahani Tlas Mili, Nachsi Balabatim Minichseon. They both say, pay close attention to this Gemara, very profound Gemara. There are 3 reasons for which a balabas, right? One of us loses their property. Literally again, plus mili nachsi balabat minchsen. Literally translated means for three purposes, a balabas will take leave of his property. What does it mean to take leave of your property? It means to lose it. What are the three reasons why people lose their property? Number one, the mafki avdahu lechirusa. Ultimately, again, I will say, they go ahead. Number one reason is because they emancipate their slaves. They emancipate their Gentile slaves. Number two, the Sairi Nichsaya B'Shabsa. They go out to look at their properties on Shabbos. And number three, the Kavi Su'udasaya B'Shabsa B'idan Be Midrasha. They go home to have their meal during the drasha. Listen to that one very carefully. Listen to that, I will say. They go to make Kiddush during the drasha. They go to make Kiddush during the drasha, right? Now, I will say, okay, so let's talk about this for just a little bit. Did I mention they go to make Kiddush during the drasha, right? So I'll say that is one of the reasons why a balabas loses his money, loses his property. And I will say, now what's the pshat with this? So first of all, let's just finish the rest of the story. There were two families in Yerushalayim. Achas kava su'udasa b'shabsa. So I will say one of them established him, and I will say now literally what it means is so just seriously on Shabbos the Rav used to give a drasha, used to give a shir, or somebody gave a shir. So I will say remember for Balabatim, Shabbos was often the time when they were learning because during the week they were working. So I will say so don't go out to eat, don't go out to drink, don't schedule Shabbos Suda when it's the shir. Yeah, you have the rest of Shabbos to eat and drink. Don't do it during the drasha. So the Gemara tells a story of two families in Yerushalayim. One went ahead and achas kavas udas b'shabsa. So it is interesting. So one of them purposely went out to eat, made their meal during the drasha. The achas kavas udas be'erev Shabbos. I will say, interestingly enough, one of them, although well-meaning, decided to schedule their primary meal for Friday night, Shabbos night, to save their time ultimately again for Shabbos day. So I will say, remember, the halacha is the primary su'uda of Shabbos is Shabbos day, not Shabbos night. Their mistake was they made their primary su'uda Shabbos night and not Shabbos day. I will say the primary mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos is by day and not by night. Obviously, we have an obligation to have a suda at night, but we know this in halacha, right? If you have, let's say, a delicacy, right? When should you use it? The ideal is to save it for day and not to use it at night, right? Lemais again, because the primary mitzvah of oneg. So two families both made an interesting mistake, right? So first family made the mistake of scheduling their meal during the drasha. Second family, in an effort to get to the drasha, scheduled the primary meal for Shabbos night as opposed to Shabbos day, and they made a mistake. And I will say, what happened? Ushtehen ne'ekru. And ultimately, I will say, both ultimately, again, were uprooted from their property. Both are uprooted from their property. Rashi says over here, Rashi says, Bi'idan be midrasha, kishachacham dorish drasha shlarabim b'Shabbos, then yoshim b'su'uda, pavlam lahaktim ola acher. I will say, don't go out to eat and drink during the drasha, right? In other words, have your suda either earlier, have your suda either later, but lamaisa, don't go ahead and miss Torah for the sake of eating and drinking. Next Rashi, Be'erev Shabbos, Belele Shabbos, Ve'im kan kavod Shabbos, the kaimalon, kavod yom, kodem lekavod laila. We'll say the kavod of the daytime of Shabbos takes precedence over the kavod of nighttime Shabbos. Ve'im hayu miskavnin b'shel bitl beis hamedrash. So we'll say, so again, they had good intent. The second family had good intentions. They moved the primary meal to Friday night so that it would not conflict with the drasha on Shabbos day. But that's a mistake as well. And as a result, both of these families lost their property. I will say very quickly, what's the pshat of these three things? In other words, whenever you see something that's in Chazal, if you violate three things, you go ahead and you lose your property. So I will say again, emancipate your avadim, go out and see your property on Shabbos, and eat during the drasha, eat and drink during the drasha. So I'll say, what's the pshat? What's the common denominator? So I'll say, the Ger Rebbe, the Beis Yisrael, says something amazing. He comments on the first of these. He says, what does it mean? He says, what does it mean ultimately? The mafki avdaihu l'cherusa. So I'll say, we're translating it as, you emancipate your eved. So I'll say, listen to this. What says the Beis Yisrael? Get ready for this. All of us have certain things that we're supposed to keep enslaved. Right? Let's say we have certain desires, we have certain wants, we have certain lusts, we have certain proclivities. And what's our goal? In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu often of us want to be clear, often HaKadosh Baruch Hu created us that way. These are not things like that I picked up, right? Or that I want per se, but often they are things with which the Ribono Shel Olam created me with. What's my job? What's my job? Keep it under control. Keep it under control. Make it your eved. Make it your eved. See, Rabbi say, when it comes to the desires in life, I have one of two possibilities. Either I become a servant to my desires, or my desires become a servant to me. The goal is number two. Make your taivas, make your desires your servant. So Rabbi say, what is Gemara talking about over here? What I was talking about over here, an individual, demafki avdaihu l'cherusa. Rabbi say, who's a guy who's mafki avdaihu l'cherusa? I've set my avodim free, which means I allow my desires and my wants to rule me. I've emancipated them. Whatever I feel like doing, I do. There's no checks, there's no balances, there's no stopping, there's nothing. My avodim, the things I should keep under control, I have set them free. In other words, Rabbi say, I live without boundaries. Now Rabbi says the Beis Yisrael, that's the rest of the list as well. What's the Sayin Chesay b'Shabsa? Right? Guy goes to see his property on Shabbos. Rabbi say, have a whole week to work. You have a whole week to work. You have 6 days to focus on work. 6 days. One day, the Ribono Shel Olam says, keep it in check. One day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, don't engage in business. Don't do it. Don't look at it. Don't study it. Don't think about it. Move it away. In other words, create a boundary. Create a boundary. Now, let's say, what's the third thing? People who go out to eat and drink during the drasha, right? Let's say, you have a whole Shabbos to eat and drink. And by the way, not only that, it's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah. So during the time of the drasha, you can't keep it under control. During that little bit of time, a person's unable to restrain themselves. So the common denominator, Rabbi say, is that halacha l'maisa, this person lacks restraint. He's freeing his avadim, the things that he should keep enslaved, he's letting them go. Right? One day a week, a person should control themselves, exercise self-restraint. We've learned in Piagetz, exercise self-restraint, and don't engage in business. You can't do that. Whole Shabbos, you have to eat and drink. For whatever the amount of time is for the drasha, long drasha, short drasha, whatever it is, don't eat and drink. Can't do that. Can't do that. So we'll say, so what happens? So we'll say, so what does the Gemara say? When a person doesn't have self-restraint, you know what that means? They can't hold on to things. Right? They can't hold themselves back. Well, guess what? If you can't hold yourself back, chances are you're not going to be able to hold on to your possessions either. So you're say, it's not a punishment. It's a cause and effect. It's cause and effect. If I'm a person without self-restraint, if I'm a person without self-control, if I'm a person who can't hold on to things, then look at the Lashon of the Gemara. It doesn't say HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to take away your property. Rather, what does it say? Tzlas mili, behani tatzmi, nachsi balabat min chseyon. So ultimately, balabatim are separated. They're going to walk away from their property. Nachsi means they're going to be removed. So we'll say, because when you don't have self-control, you can't hold yourself back. You can't hold on to things. You can't keep things in. You can't keep things in control. So over time, that midah is just going to have an impact on your possessions as well. The power, Rabbi say, of being people who are in control of their avodim, who are in control of their profession, who are in control of their bodily taivas. So we'll say, that's it. Life is all about the ability to exercise restraint and to know that everything has its time and everything has its place. Work on that midah of self-restraint, and a person will be successful, not just in the realm of the spiritual, but in the realm of the material as well. Let's go a little bit weiter. Amarav, Hamakdish Abdu Yotzalacherus. Let's say a person who consecrates his Eved, the Eved goes free. My timer, what's the reason? Gufei, so the Gemara says, my timer. My timer, Gufei lo Kaddish, L'dmeid lo Kamar, Delehavi am Kaddish. Because what's this? Obviously, because just by process of elimination, if I'm Makdish my Eved, I'm not being Makdish his body, right? Because ultimately, again, Beis Hamikdash doesn't need to own an Eved, right? Ultimately, again, I'm not consecrating his value, because if I was consecrating his value, there are ways to say that as well. So therefore, by definition, what I'm saying is, when I make him Hektish, so to speak, I'm making him Am Kaddish. What I'm saying is, you are part of the consecrated nation, i.e. you're a Yid. Rav Yosef Amarav Hamafkir Avdo Yotze L'Cherus. And ultimately, Rav Yosef says, if you make your Eved Hefker, he goes free. Mando Amar Hekdish Koshkin Mafkir. The one who said by Hekdish, ultimately he goes free, certainly agrees by Hefker. Mando Amar Mafkir, but the one who says by Ma Hefker, Aval Makdish Lo. But I will say, when a person has Makdish his Eved, maybe not. ultimately Dilma Lidmei Ka'amar. Because maybe ultimately, also, what am I saying when I'm Makdish my Eved? Maybe I'm not emancipating him, but maybe ultimately I'm actually going ahead and pledging his value to the Beis HaMikdash. So I will say, so ultimately, again, halacha l'maaseh, that's really how we paskin. So if you're mafkir your Eved, by the way, he does go free. If you're Makdish your Eved, we assume that ultimately what you're doing is you're being Makdish his Zayir. So we'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach. What a daf. What a daf. All right, Chavra on Zoom. Have a great day, everyone. Have a great day, a good Erev Shabbos, an incredible schus to be able